The truth about Wyatt Earp and the last Apache warrior, hero or frontier invader. That question has echoed through the canyons of Arizona for over 140 years, and today we are going to answer it. Not with the polished legend, not with the Hollywood version, but with the raw, complicated, sometimes uncomfortable truth that textbooks and movies have buried under layers of dust and myth. Wyatt Earp. The name alone conjures images of a tall figure in a long coat, walking down a dusty street, badge gleaming, revolver ready. The quintessential American hero, the man who tamed the Wild West. The lawman who stood for justice when chaos ruled the frontier. But here is what they never told you. While Wyatt Earp was building his legend in Tombstone, just a few hundred miles away, another figure was fighting a very different battle. A battle for survival, a battle for his people, a battle against the very expansion that men like Earp represented. His name has been spoken with fear, with respect, with hatred, and with reverence. He was called a warrior. He was called a leader. He was called the last symbol of Apache resistance, and his story intersects with the myth of Wyatt Earp in ways that will fundamentally change how you see the American frontier. This is not just a story about two men. This is a story about two worlds colliding, about what happens when one civilization decides another must disappear, about the real cost of the legends we celebrate. So let me ask you something before we begin. What if everything you thought you knew about heroes and invaders was wrong? What if the line between them was never as clear as the history books made it seem? Because by the end of this story, you might see that badge on Wyatt Earp's chest very differently, and you might understand why, to some, he was never a hero at all. Let us start where all great Western stories begin, in the dust. The year was 1879. The Arizona Territory was a pressure cooker of ambition, greed, and desperate survival. Silver had been discovered in the hills near a place the Mexicans called Tombstone, named for the rocky outcroppings that looked like grave markers dotting the landscape. Prospectors flooded in by the thousands, and where prospectors went, trouble followed. Wyatt Earp arrived in Tombstone in December of 1879 with his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and a reputation that preceded him like a thundercloud. He had been a lawman in Wichita. He had been a lawman in Dodge City. He had faced down some of the most dangerous men on the frontier and walked away with barely a scratch. But Wyatt Earp was also something else, something the legend makers preferred to leave out. He was a businessman, a gambler, a man who understood that in the chaos of the frontier, money and power went to those who knew how to work the system. And Tombstone, with its silver mines and its endless stream of desperate men with money to spend, was the perfect place for a man like Wyatt Earp. He did not come to Tombstone to enforce the law. He came to get rich. Within months of arriving, Wyatt had interests in gambling halls, mining claims, and real estate. He had positioned himself at the center of Tombstone's power structure, aligned with the Republican business interests that controlled the town's economy. His brother Virgil would eventually become the town marshal. But make no mistake, the Earps were not disinterested servants of justice. They were players, and the game they were playing had stakes far higher than anyone in Tombstone realized. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people never learn about. While the Earps were consolidating power in Tombstone, something far more significant was happening just to the east. The Apache people, who had lived in these lands for centuries, were being systematically removed, relocated, and confined to reservations that grew smaller with each passing year, and they were not going quietly. The Apache had been resisting American expansion for decades. They knew the land in ways that the settlers could never understand. They could travel 50 miles in a day through terrain that would defeat cavalry horses. They could survive in deserts that would dehydrate and destroy anyone not born to them. They were, pound for pound, the most formidable guerrilla fighters the United States Army had ever faced, and leading their resistance were warriors whose names would become synonymous with defiance. Now, I want you to understand something crucial here. The conflict between the Apache and the American settlers was not a simple story of good versus evil. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, with suffering on all sides. Settlers lost their lives, soldiers lost their lives, and the Apache lost everything: their land, their freedom, their way of life. But to understand what Wyatt Earp really represented, you have to understand what his success was built upon. Every silver mine in Tombstone sat on land that had been Apache territory. Every ranch, every town, every railroad track that made the Arizona Territory accessible to men like Wyatt Earp existed because the Apache had been forced off their ancestral lands. Wyatt Earp did not take that land himself. He did not ride with the cavalry. He did not burn villages or force families onto reservations, but he profited from it every single day. And that is the uncomfortable truth that the legend of Wyatt Earp conveniently ignores. The man with the badge was standing on ground soaked with the tears of people who had lived there for generations. The law he enforced protected the interests of those who had taken everything from the Apache. The order he maintained was the order of conquest. So when we ask the question, hero or invader, we have to be honest about what heroism meant on the American frontier. It meant protecting one set of people while another set was being destroyed. Let us talk about the Apache warrior, whose story runs parallel to Wyatt Earp's rise, because their lives, though they likely never met face to face, were mirror images of each other. One was fighting to build a new world, the other was fighting to save an old one. In the early 1880s, while Wyatt Earp was dealing cards in Tombstone saloons and calculating his next business venture, Apache leaders were conducting a resistance campaign that tied up thousands of American soldiers and terrified settlers across 3 territories. The tactics they used were revolutionary. They would strike fast, disappear into the mountains and be gone before anyone could respond. They knew every water source, every hidden canyon, every secret trail through terrain that looked impassable to outsiders. They fought not with the massed formations that American generals understood, but with mobility, surprise, and an intimate knowledge of the land that came from centuries of living in harmony with it. One particular Apache leader became the face of this resistance. His story is one of the most remarkable in American history. He was not born a chief. He earned his position through sheer force of will and an ability to survive that seemed almost supernatural to his enemies. This warrior had watched his family taken from him. He had seen his people pushed from their homes again and again, and he had decided that he would resist until his last breath. When he finally surrendered, after years of evading the largest military force ever assembled to capture a single man, he did so not because he was defeated militarily. He did so because there was simply no one left to fight for. His people were scattered, starving, dying from diseases they had no immunity against. The resistance had become a slow suicide, and here is the part that breaks my heart. After his surrender, this warrior was promised certain things. He was promised that his people would be allowed to return to their homeland. He was promised that they would be treated with dignity. Those promises were broken. Almost immediately, he spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war. He was paraded at world fairs like an exhibit. He was made to ride in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, a symbol of American triumph over the savage frontier. He was never allowed to return home. He passed away in 1909, still a prisoner, still dreaming of the mountains he had been forced to leave behind. Now, let us go back to Wyatt Earp and what he was doing during these same years. In October of 1881, the famous gunfight near the OK Corral took place, 30 seconds of gunfire that would define Wyatt Earp's legend for eternity. 3 men on the other side fell. Wyatt walked away without a scratch. The mythology that grew from those 30 seconds is extraordinary. Wyatt Earp became the symbol of frontier justice, the man who stood up to the outlaws, the hero who would not back down. But the reality was far messier. The men who faced the Earps that day were not simple outlaws. They were part of a loose confederation of ranchers and cowboys known as the Cowboys, with a capital C. They were aligned with the Democratic political faction in Tombstone, in opposition to the Republican faction that the Earps represented. This was not just a gunfight. It was political conflict expressed through violence. The Earps and the Clantons and McClorys had been feuding for months. There were cattle deals gone bad. There were accusations of stage robbery. There were personal grudges and wounded pride. When the smoke cleared and 3 men lay in the dirt, the Earps were arrested and charged with taking lives unlawfully. They were eventually cleared, but the controversy never died. Even then, many people saw the Earps not as heroes, but as men who had used their badges to settle personal scores. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what comes next reveals truths about American history that most channels are too afraid to tell. You do not want to miss a single revelation. The aftermath of the OK Corral gunfight was not a return to peace and order. It was the beginning of a vendetta that would stain Wyatt Earp's reputation forever. 2 months after the gunfight, Virgil Earp was ambushed while walking across a Tombstone street. Shotgun blasts shattered his left arm so badly that he would never fully use it again. He survived, but his days as an effective lawman were over. 3 months after that, Morgan Earp was playing billiards in a Tombstone saloon when shots came through the window. He was struck in the spine. He passed away in Wyatt's arms, reportedly saying something like that he could not see a thing. What happened next is where the legend of Wyatt Earp gets truly complicated. Wyatt Earp assembled a group of men and went hunting. Not for justice in any legal sense, for revenge, pure and simple. Over the next few weeks, Wyatt and his posse tracked down and ended the lives of several men they believed responsible for his brother's fates. Frank Stillwell was found at a train station in Tucson with multiple wounds. Florentino Cruz met a similar end at a wood camp. Indian Charlie was found in the Whetstone Mountains. There were no trials, no juries, no legal proceedings of any kind. Wyatt Earp had become judge, jury, and executioner. And here is the thing that history often forgets. Wyatt Earp had warrants issued for his arrest during this time. He was technically a fugitive from justice. The law he had once worn on his chest was now hunting him. He fled Arizona and never returned to face those charges. So I ask you again, hero or invader? Because from where I am standing, Wyatt Earp during the Vendetta ride was not so different from the Apache warriors that American propaganda painted as savages. He was a man who had lost people he loved, a man who had decided that the official channels of justice were inadequate, a man who took matters into his own hands. The only difference was which side of history he was on. When the Apache warriors raided settlements to recover captured family members or to strike back at those who had betrayed treaty promises, they were called bloodthirsty criminals. When Wyatt Earp rode across Arizona taking lives outside of any legal authority, he eventually became a Hollywood hero. Same actions, different mythology, and that tells you everything you need to know about how history gets written. Now let us zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because the story of Wyatt Earp and the Apache resistance is really a story about America itself, about who we chose to celebrate and who we chose to forget, about whose violence was called justice and whose was called savagery. The Arizona Territory of the 1880s was a place where multiple worlds collided. There were the Apache, whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. There were the Mexicans, who had been there since the Spanish colonial era. There were the Americans, newly arrived and hungry for wealth. And there were the soldiers, sent to impose order on a chaos that American expansion had created. Wyatt Earp navigated this world brilliantly. He understood power. He understood money. He understood that in a place without established rules, the man who could project strength would thrive. He was not a simple lawman maintaining order. He was an opportunist who used the badge when it served him and discarded it when it did not. But the Apache warriors navigating the same territory were doing something fundamentally different. They were not trying to get rich. They were not trying to build an empire. They were trying to survive. Every raid they conducted was an attempt to feed their families. Every horse they took was transportation for people who had been stripped of everything. Every act of resistance was a desperate attempt to hold on to something of the life they had known before the settlers came. And they were losing, slowly, painfully, inevitably. By 1886, the last Apache resistance had crumbled. The final holdouts were rounded up and shipped to Florida as prisoners of war. Men, women, and children who had never raised a hand against anyone were imprisoned alongside the warriors, punished simply for being Apache. Some of those prisoners were the very Apache scouts who had helped the army track down the resistors. They were rewarded for their loyalty with the same imprisonment as those they had helped capture. That is the American frontier that Wyatt Earp lived in. That is the context that his legend emerged from. Now I want to tell you about a moment that crystallizes everything we have been discussing. A moment that shows exactly how complicated these frontier stories really were. In 1881, the same year as the OK Corral gunfight, there was an incident at a place called Cibecue Creek. The army was worried about a spiritual movement among the Apache, led by a medicine man who was preaching about the return of the old ways. They sent soldiers to arrest him. What happened at Cibecue Creek was chaos. Fighting broke out. Soldiers fell. Apache scouts who had been working with the army turned on their commanders. The medicine man was taken down. This was not just a skirmish. It was one of the only times in American history that native scouts actively revolted against the army they were serving. It showed how deep the tensions ran, how fragile the peace was, and how the Apache were being pushed to breaking points that no human being should have to endure. And while this was happening, Wyatt Earp was in Tombstone, dealing cards and counting his money. These two worlds existed simultaneously, separated by a few hundred miles of desert, but they were connected in ways that the people living in them rarely acknowledged. Every dollar that flowed through Tombstone's gambling halls and saloons was there because of the mines. Every mine was there because the land had been secured. Every piece of secured land represented another piece of the Apache homeland that had been taken. Wyatt Earp's prosperity was built on Apache dispossession, not directly, not intentionally perhaps, but inextricably. This is not about assigning personal guilt. Wyatt Earp did not make the policies that destroyed the Apache. He did not lead the cavalry charges. He did not sign the treaties that were broken again and again, but he was part of a system, and that system was designed to take everything from one group of people and give it to another. When we call Wyatt Earp a hero, we are celebrating that system. We are saying that the order he maintained was good and just. We are endorsing the civilization that his badge represented, and when we do that, we have to be honest about what that civilization cost. Let me tell you about what life was actually like for the Apache during the years that Wyatt Earp was becoming a legend. The reservations they were forced onto were nothing like their traditional homelands. They were given the worst land, the land that settlers did not want. There was often not enough food. The rations promised by the government were frequently delayed, stolen by corrupt officials, or simply not provided at all. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The explicit goal was to destroy Apache culture entirely, to make the children forget who they were. If you want me to comment on a phrase that I find emotionally impactful from this story so far, please leave a comment saying, "Their land was stolen, but their spirit was never broken." This phrase captures the essence of what the Apache endured and how their legacy persists despite everything that was taken from them. Families were separated. Traditional governance was dismantled. Ceremonies were banned. Everything that made the Apache who they were was systematically attacked. And when some of them resisted, when they fled the reservations and tried to return to their traditional way of life, they were hunted down like animals. Thousands of soldiers, chasing a few hundred men, women, and children across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. This is the context that the legend of Wyatt Earp exists within. This is what was happening just over the horizon while he was building his mythology in Tombstone. But here is what makes this story even more complicated. The Apache warriors were not saints either. In their resistance, innocent people suffered. Settlers who had nothing to do with government policy were caught in the crossfire. Families lost members to raids. There is no way to tell this story honestly without acknowledging that. But there is a crucial difference that often gets lost in the telling. The Apache were fighting for survival. They were fighting against a system that was explicitly designed to destroy them. They were fighting because every other option had been taken away. Wyatt Earp was fighting for profit and power. He was fighting to establish himself in a system that was working exactly as designed. He was fighting to get ahead in a world that was already structured to benefit him. When an Apache warrior struck back at the system that was destroying his people, he was resisting oppression. When Wyatt Earp tracked down the men who had harmed his brothers, he was enforcing a personal code that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with revenge. Same violence. Completely different contexts, and yet somehow one became a hero and the other became a villain. Let us fast forward now to what happened to both of these figures after the dust settled. Wyatt Earp lived a long life. He left Arizona after the Vendetta ride and spent decades wandering the American West. He tried his hand at various businesses. He prospected for gold in Alaska during the Klondike Rush. He refereed boxing matches. He became friends with early Hollywood figures who would eventually turn his story into the mythology we know today. He passed away in 1929 in Los Angeles, surrounded by friends and admirers who saw him as the last of the great frontier lawmen. His biography, written with his cooperation, became the template for how the American West would be remembered. Wyatt Earp, the man who tamed Tombstone. Wyatt Earp, the hero of the OK Corral. The Apache warrior whose story paralleled his had a very different end. After his surrender, he was shipped from one prison to another. Arizona, Florida, Alabama, Oklahoma, always a prisoner, always far from home. He spent his final years trying to negotiate for the return of his people to Arizona. He dictated his life story to a writer, hoping that if people understood what had really happened, maybe something could change. Nothing changed. He was never allowed to go home. He passed away from pneumonia in 1909 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the military post where he had been held prisoner. He was buried there, thousands of miles from the mountains he had defended with everything he had. And here is the final bitter irony. Today, Wyatt Earp is remembered as an American hero, Movies have been made about him. Television shows, books, video games. His image has become synonymous with frontier justice and the taming of the Wild West. The Apache warrior is also remembered, but often as a villain, as a savage who terrorized innocent settlers, as an obstacle that had to be overcome for civilization to advance. Same era, same conflicts, completely opposite mythologies. And that mythology matters because it shapes how we understand our past, and how we understand our past shapes how we navigate our present. When we celebrate Wyatt Earp uncritically, we are implicitly endorsing the system he represented. We are saying that the American conquest of the West was fundamentally good and just. We are saying that the people who resisted that conquest were villains who deserved to be defeated. But when we look at the full story, when we see both Wyatt Earp and the Apache warriors as complex human beings navigating impossible circumstances, the picture becomes much more nuanced. Wyatt Earp was not a simple hero. He was a man who did what he had to do to survive and prosper in a violent world. He protected his family. He pursued his interests. He lived by a code that made sense to him, even when that code conflicted with the law he claimed to represent. The Apache warriors were not simple villains. They were people fighting for their survival against a system determined to destroy them. They made difficult choices in impossible situations. They loved their families. They had dreams and hopes and fears just like anyone else. The real tragedy of the American frontier is not that there were heroes and villains. It is that ordinary human beings were caught up in forces beyond their control, and some of them won while others lost everything. Wyatt Earp won, not because he was more virtuous or more deserving, but because he was on the side that had more guns, more soldiers, more resources, and more willingness to use them. The Apache lost, not because they were less brave or less intelligent, but because they were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that would not stop coming until there was nothing left to resist. That is the truth about Wyatt Earp and the last Apache warrior. It is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of human beings caught up in the great machinery of history, some of them exalted and some of them crushed. And when we tell that story honestly, we honor both the man with the badge and the warrior in the mountains. We see them not as symbols or archetypes, but as people, flawed, complicated, struggling people doing what they thought they had to do. Now let us talk about what happened after both of these men were gone, because their legacies have evolved in ways that reveal a lot about how America has changed over the past century. For decades after his passing, Wyatt Earp's legend only grew. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of Western television, and Wyatt Earp was everywhere. He was portrayed as the ultimate frontier hero, the man who stood for law and order in a lawless land. Generations of American children grew up watching actors portray him as a paragon of justice. But something started to shift in the 1970s and 80s. A new generation of historians began to dig deeper into the Earp story. They found the court records from the OK Corral hearing. They found newspaper accounts from the time that painted a very different picture than the legend. They found evidence that Wyatt Earp was far more complicated and far less heroic than the mythology suggested. Revisionist westerns began to appear, films that questioned the traditional hero narratives. Movies like Unforgiven asked what it really meant to be a gunfighter, what kind of person actually takes lives for a living, what kind of trauma that life leaves behind. The Apache story also began to be told differently. Native American voices that had been silenced for generations started to be heard. The boarding schools where children had been sent to forget their heritage were exposed as places of profound trauma. The broken treaties, the stolen land, the systematic destruction of cultures began to be discussed openly. This did not happen easily. There was and still is tremendous resistance to revising the mythology of the American West. Many people have deep emotional investments in the heroic narrative. The idea that their ancestors were part of something unjust is painful to accept. But the truth has a way of emerging, even when it is uncomfortable. Today, the Apache warrior, who was once portrayed as a bloodthirsty savage, is increasingly understood as a freedom fighter. Someone who resisted oppression with everything he had. Someone whose story deserves to be told with respect and nuance, not as a one-dimensional villain. And Wyatt Earp is increasingly understood as what he actually was, a complex man who did both admirable and terrible things. A man who lived by a personal code that sometimes aligned with justice and sometimes conflicted with it entirely. A product of his time, with all the limitations that implies. This evolution in understanding is not about tearing down heroes for the sake of tearing them down. It is about telling more complete stories, more honest stories, stories that include all the people who were affected, not just the ones who won. Because here is what I believe. We do not honor the past by lying about it. We honor the past by telling the truth, even when that truth is complicated. We honor our ancestors, all of them, by seeing them as full human beings, not as cardboard cutouts in a mythology designed to make us feel good. Wyatt Earp was human. He loved his brothers. He sought fortune and found it. He made enemies and destroyed them. He lived a long life and died surrounded by friends. That is a human story, with all the moral complexity that human stories contain. The Apache warriors were human. They loved their families. They fought for their land. They lost everything and kept fighting anyway. They were captured, imprisoned, and never gave up hope of returning home. That is also a human story, one of the most heartbreaking in American history. When we tell both of these stories together, when we see them as intertwined rather than separate, we get closer to the truth of what the American frontier really was. It was not a story of heroes taming a wilderness. It was a story of one civilization displacing another, of power being exercised and resisted, of human beings on all sides doing what they thought was right or necessary or simply inevitable. And that story does not have clear heroes and villains. It has people, complicated, struggling, sometimes noble and sometimes terrible people. That is the truth about Wyatt Earp and the last Apache warrior. Hero or invader? The answer, I think, is that he was both. And neither. He was human, and humans contain multitudes. The land that Wyatt Earp walked across, the land where he built his fortune and his legend, is still there. The mountains where the Apache warriors made their last stand are still there. The sky that watched all of it happen has not changed. But we have changed. We can see things now that people could not see then. We can understand perspectives that were invisible to those living through these events. And with that understanding comes responsibility. The responsibility to tell these stories fully, to honor all of the people who lived them, to learn what we can from their triumphs and their tragedies. Because the American West was not a simple place. It was a crucible where human nature was tested in extreme conditions, where the best and worst of humanity emerged side by side, where legends were born and peoples were destroyed. Wyatt Earp walked through that crucible and came out a legend. The Apache warriors walked through the same crucible and came out prisoners. The difference between them was not virtue or courage or intelligence. The difference was power, pure, brutal, historical power. And when we understand that, when we really understand it, we can never look at those Western movies quite the same way again. So the next time you see Wyatt Earp portrayed as an uncomplicated hero, remember what we discussed today. Remember the Apache families that were torn apart while he was counting his money in Tombstone. Remember the warrior who was never allowed to go home. Remember that every legend has a shadow side, and that shadow is often where the most important truths are hiding. This has been a story about two men, but it has also been a story about America, about who we choose to remember and who we choose to forget, about whose stories get told and whose get buried. The frontier is closed now, the wars are over, but the questions remain, and how we answer them says everything about who we are and who we want to become. Let us talk about one more thing before we finish, the land itself. Because the land remembers, the land does not care about mythology or propaganda. The land simply is what it is, and it holds the truth, even when people try to bury it. If you go to southeastern Arizona today, you can still see the landscape that shaped these stories. The desert stretches out in every direction, beautiful and brutal and indifferent. The mountains rise up, their peaks catching the first light of dawn and the last light of dusk. The air is dry and clear, the kind of air that makes you feel like you can see forever. This is the land that the Apache loved, this is the land they fought for. This is the land they were forced to leave. And if you know where to look, you can still find traces of their presence. Rock formations that served as lookout points, hidden water sources that only they knew about, caves that provided shelter from the desert sun and the winter cold. The land remembers them. The land does not care that the history books called them savages. The land knows that they were its most intimate companions, its most devoted students, its most skilled inhabitants. Tombstone is still there too. You can walk down the same streets that Wyatt Earp walked. You can stand in the spot where the famous gunfight happened. You can visit the graveyards where the men who fell that day are buried. But Tombstone is a tourist attraction now, a theme park version of the Wild West. Actors stage gunfights for visitors. Gift shops sell replicas of frontier gear. The reality of what happened there has been polished into entertainment. And maybe that is inevitable. Maybe that is what happens to all history eventually. It gets simplified and packaged and sold. The rough edges get smoothed away. The uncomfortable truths get buried. But we do not have to accept that. We can choose to dig deeper. We can choose to seek out the complicated stories, the ones that do not fit neatly into hero narratives. We can choose to honor the past by refusing to lie about it. That is what I have tried to do today, to tell you a story that is truer than the one you might have heard before, to show you that the American frontier was a place of profound moral complexity, where people on all sides were capable of both heroism and horror. Wyatt Earp was not a simple hero. The Apache warriors were not simple villains. History is not a movie with clear protagonists and antagonists. History is human beings making choices in circumstances not of their choosing. History is power and resistance. History is winners writing the textbooks and losers being forgotten. But losers are not always wrong, and winners are not always right. The Apache knew something that Wyatt Earp never understood. They knew that the land was not something to be owned and exploited. They knew that human beings were part of nature, not masters of it. They knew that sustainable living was more important than rapid wealth. Everything they knew, everything they valued, was systematically destroyed in the name of progress. And what did that progress give us? Mines that poisoned the water, ranches that stripped the soil, cities that sprawl across the desert, dependent on water pumped from aquifers that are slowly emptying. The Apache way of life was not primitive. It was sustainable. It had lasted for centuries, and could have lasted for centuries more. The civilization that replaced it has existed for less than 200 years, and already the cracks are showing. So who were the real visionaries? The people who lived in harmony with the land for generations, or the people who extracted everything they could as fast as they could? That is a question worth asking. That is a question that the legend of Wyatt Earp never considered. But we can consider it now. We can look at the past with clear eyes and learn from both its triumphs and its tragedies. We can honor the Apache not just as brave resistors, but as people who understood something profound about how human beings should relate to the world around them. And we can see Wyatt Earp for what he really was, not a hero, not a villain, just a man, shaped by his time, making his way through a world that was being transformed by forces beyond anyone's control. That transformation is complete now. The frontier is closed. The Apache are still here, despite everything that was done to destroy them. Their languages are still spoken. Their traditions are still practiced. Their connection to the land endures. And that persistence, that refusal to disappear despite generations of oppression, might be the most heroic story of the American West. Not Wyatt Earp walking down a dusty street with a gun on his hip, but families keeping their culture alive against all odds. Communities rebuilding what was torn apart. Young people learning the languages that the boarding schools tried to destroy. That is heroism. That is courage. That is the story that deserves to be told alongside all the gunfighter legends and cowboy mythologies. The truth about Wyatt Earp and the last Apache warrior is not a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a human story, with all the complexity that implies. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. That history is never as simple as we want it to be. That the people we celebrate were often more flawed than we admit. And that the people we forgot were often more remarkable than we ever knew. Thank you for walking through this story with me today. Thank you for being willing to see the American West in a more complete way. Thank you for honoring both the man with the badge and the warrior in the mountains. If you watched this far, it is because you really care about understanding history in all its complexity. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the full stories that this channel tries to tell. And while you are at it, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. Share this with someone who loves history, someone who can handle the complicated truth. Because that is what we do here. We tell the stories that others simplify. We honor the people that others forget. We dig deeper than the surface, and there is so much more to discover. The mountains are still there, the desert is still there, the land still remembers everything that happened, and now, so do you. Until next time.